evening, everybody out there in YouTube land. Actually, it's morning for most of you, and probably afternoon for a few of us. This is T-Shirted Historian, and I'm live here with Andre Einheirar. Is that right?
Yeah, close enough. Andre Einheirar, but yeah, I'm not going to pass any judgment.
And if I'm correct, the last name is the name of what they would call the warriors who were slain in Valhalla.
Yes, that would be Odin's chosen warriors. That is correct.
That's very cool. Well, we're here to talk to you today about Robert E. Howard. And if you don't actually know who that author is, you definitely know his creations, because I don't think there's a sci-fi fantasy fan walking the earth who has not heard of Conan the Barbarian. But yeah, I am happy to have Andre on board. I initially got the idea for this because I watched his Conan retrospectives about a year or two ago, and I was just like, I was floored at how good they were, at how concise and how expansive his knowledge of the Conan character and the movies were. So myself being a Robert E. Howard Conan fan, I live here in Texas. Of course, I grew up with Conan as a child, probably from, I don't know, I want to say 8 to 9 years old, reading the comic books. And as I got older, I was able to read more of Howard's original stuff, which is just immense. Speaking of which, Andre, are there any particular Robert E. Howard Conan books or anything that are favorites or stories, I should say?
There are a couple. I mean, they're all good, but a particular favorite, that's hard to say. One of my favorite Howard stories is actually not even a Conan story, in The Shadow Kingdom, which was a cult story. To me, that's one of my absolute favorite stories. But favorite Conan stories, I really like The God in the Bowl, which is one that wasn't initially published, but still, that's absolutely one of my favorite ones, because it has so many cool elements in it. So that is one that really stands out to me as a favorite. And also The Jewels of Gwaelor, or however it is pronounced. I've only ever seen it read, actually, or seen it in writing. I never heard it, so I don't know how to pronounce it. And of course, Red Nails. Like classic stories. So those would be among my favorites. But of course, I discovered them later than you, actually. I didn't read those stories until I was in my late 20s for the first time. Like, I knew of Conan and Howard since very early on. But I didn't become a fan, per se, until I was, I don't know, 25, 26, thereabouts. Yeah. So I came to it quite late. Of course, I call him made up for it then. But...
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say for me, I mean, yeah, a lot of Howard's original stories written by him are probably the best. I mean, Tower of the Elephant is one of my favorites, but for me, the story that is my absolute favorite is Beyond the Black River. And that is where Conan has to deal with the Pictish tribes on the border. And the thing is, what makes that story so special to me is, I'm a West Texas boy, and living in West Texas, Howard lived here too. He walked the same places I do. And when I see the countryside that surrounds Cross Plains, like Pecan Bayou and some of these other places, I can kind of imagine where Howard was getting his inspiration from. And Black River really does recall parts of Texas to me. And that makes it a little bit more grounded in reality for me. So maybe that's why it's my favorite. It is also just a hell of a good story. It's very visceral.
Exactly. And I think that Beyond the Black River is very special for that reason, because I have, to my regret so far, never been to Texas. That is an omission that I intend to correct at the first opportune moment, which sadly wasn't Howard Days this year, where I really wanted to be, but always next year, I guess. But anyway, because the amazing thing with Howard is how incredibly vibrant he writes. As in, when you read the stories, they seem like the first-hand account of someone who was there, either in our distant past or our even more distant fictional past, like the Hyborian Age. But no matter where it is, it comes across as so vibrant and so real and so livid, for lack of better terms. And the reason of that, of course, was that Howard was a master in taking situations that he knew, and then he would transport his own lived experiences into other settings. And that way he would make them feel much more lived in. And the cool thing about Beyond the Black River is that there we actually have a real life setting that inspired it, which I have never seen with my own eyes, but you have, of course.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify for the audience, Howard Days is a yearly event that happens in June of every year, 11 through 12 usually, where scholars and aficionados, writers, and things get together at the Robert E. Howard Museum, which is actually his old house in Cross Plains, Texas, where I visited to take a lot of the photos that you saw in the opening video, and probably that I'll be referencing throughout the video. But this is a photo of the poster for this year's 2021 Howard Days, which, like Andre, I unfortunately missed, despite the fact that Cross Plains is not that far from me. Time being what it is, I get involved with other things and I forget.
Yeah, it's so funny with like deadlines and that swooshing noise they make as they fly past. Yeah, time is funny that way.
But yeah, I guess probably should talk a little bit about Howard himself. He was born over in Peaster, which is not very far from Weatherford. He was born in 1906, which back in the time, that town probably very much less than 300 people. It didn't actually reach 300 people until 1920. I don't think he stayed there very long. His father was a physician, and they moved to this other house, which I'll grab a photo of, over in Cross Plains, Texas, which at the time was a big oil community. So the main thrust of the town was all about oil.
Yeah, as were the case with oil boom towns, which is like also something extremely fitting with Howard's writing, obviously because it inspired it. Because with an oil boom town, everyone flocked in to earn money on the oil itself, on its extraction, and on all the people working with the extraction and the entire industry set up around it, which of course attracted all kinds of shifty characters as well, giving a wealth of material to work with for later on. So it's not just a case of how all of the events of his life kind of came together and coalesced in his writing.
Yeah, it really shows you just how big of an imagination he had, was that he was able to kind of marry these images and from his books. He had history books, he had books of fantasy literature and things like that, like Mort du Arthur and things like that. And he drew from these things and applied them to characters that he met in this Texas boomtown, which these days it's really rather small. But at the time of the oil boom, it was a big town. It was crowded. It was dirty. Lots of cars of the the old Ford make all over the place. And Howard himself staunchly refused to get into the oil field work. He figured his talents were wasted, but that's not to say he wasn't a very physical man. He actually would box in the ice house, the old ice house there, for money on weekends and things. And the town has actually had it restored since then, or the person who bought it. And it looks now like it would have, more or less, back when Robert would fight there for money.
Yeah, think about that. He was an actual prize fighter. I mean, it's easy to dismiss him as a geek, but he's a geek that could kick the ass of most men, including holding his own against other prize fighters. So, like all men of the 30s, he was much harder than most men nowadays. But again, choosing to be a prize fighter, he was even tougher than most.
Mm-hmm. Storyman Jack says, yes, writer from Texas Howard Stories, very personal for me. Yes, myself also. I mean, there are a lot of Texas writers, but there's very few that we can claim as, really special. Ironcaster says, yeah, they weren't exclusively writers. They lived. Yes, this is true. They had a lot of experiences to draw from, which I think is maybe a problem with writers these days, is that they haven't really gotten outside of the comforts of their own homes and things.
Here's the thing with Howard, though, that he never really traveled that much. Mm-hmm. However, within the relatively small sphere of the world, which was Cross Plains and surrounding areas, where he would fare, in that time, with such a shift in society, with so many people intermingling, he got such a cross-section of all of humanity at once that he didn't really need to travel, because he saw kind of everything there was to see of the human experience. Any kind of behavior you will find anywhere on the planet, he saw right there. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, everything was kind of like perfect in the sense that he had a mother who was a very troubled person and who did him no favors as a general thing, but she certainly did in terms of broadening his horizons, in terms of being the best writer he could be, encouraging him to really immerse himself in classic literature, history books. All of these things made him a really, really learned man. And then just taking what he learned from there and applying it to what he saw around him in the interactions, behaviors. Plus, of course, he had a mother that was a classicist, extremely so, that felt that she was better than her surroundings. Just that attitude will also give an insight into how upper class or the upper echelons of society are everywhere, giving him an insight into that as well. So it was kind of like that place at that time was a microcosm for a writer to draw upon and to basically write about anywhere, anytime, and make it come across as believable, which is exactly what he did.
And this here is a selection of some of the books that he had on his dresser. Some of these are donations and things, but this is the kind of thing that he had. There were other books in the museum. In fact, there was it was actually quite an impressive library he had. I mean, many shelves worth of books, which is kind of TV wasn't necessarily a thing back then, of course. So, you immersed yourself in writing.
Yeah, neither was YouTube. I mean, these days, you want to learn something ancient history, go find up a documentary or something like that. But there, you had to learn it the hard way. You had to read books, and at the same time, so much excavation had been done on history and ancient societies and ancient civilizations, that there was enough that one knew already then that he could see all the trends. He could make his own informed analysis of what an extremely ancient past would look like, simply extrapolating from what we already knew, from what he had already read. So yeah, and as someone pointed out there, his accent was deep as well. Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that he would even pronounce a word like sword. He would pronounce the V in it, which is the more ancient form. So he wouldn't say sword, he would say svord, which is actually really similar to the Norwegian way of saying it, because that's where it comes from, like through Norse. Sverd is how he would say it, and he would say it the same way because it was the more ancient form.
Yeah, he literally seemed to live his characters. And as Storyman Jack pointed out, his accent was very deep. And yeah, he probably sounded. I'm from Texas. I don't have a very pronounced Texas accent because obviously I went to school and I've had lots of diction and everything else. So I don't normally fall back into my drawl unless I'm getting really, really tired. But that's the thing. If you read any of Howard's works, you would be shocked at just how verbose he actually was, and his use of the language was just amazing. Back then, the writers got paid 1 penny per word, so it was Howard's advantage to find a way to describe things as fully as he could. And one of his contemporaries, H.P. Lovecraft, would do the same thing. If you've read either of their books, you'll find that there are a lot of words that aren't commonly used in the English language anymore, like almost an archaic form of language. But to me, the way that Howard used his language, it told, it pulled you into the setting. It created a scene for you in such a way as to where you could see the things that Conan or Cull or Sailor Steve Costigan could see. You could smell them. You could experience them. It was, in a way, it was almost a virtual reality unto itself within your mind, just by the words they used.
Yeah, indeed. And to me, that is both the similarity and the difference between Howard's and Lovecraft's writing. Of course, the two of them, they were friends. They were, or at least as much friends as someone who never actually met could be, because they corresponded the old-fashioned way, and they had immense correspondence. And their worldviews were dramatically different, but still they tacitly influenced one another. But they represented very, very different worlds and worldviews. I mean, Lovecraft, he represented, in some sense, the old world. He represented the British country gentleman or aristocracy, which he considered to be the absolute peak of human civilization. And you can even tell like this in his writing, which is like very New England, I guess, very posh upper class British, but told from the point of view of someone who's extremely neurotic and is worried about losing his mind. Whereas with Howard, it's the complete opposite. I mean, it's very seldom does he tell stories in like a first person format. And if he does, it's typically like the Sailor Steve Costigan or something similar who relays events to someone else. And only then does he mix in dialect, for instance, in the writing. But then it's also used deliberately, because again, Sailor Steve Costigan, he, like Howard, speaks with a very thick local accent, indicating where in society he is from. So that was used to great effect by both Howard and by Lovecraft, respectively.
And here on the table in the Howard house, we had this. This is a postcard from H.P. Lovecraft. The writing has unfortunately faded due to time and elements, but we still have it there. I did get a close-up of the postmark and everything, but you really can't make out the words other than what is been transcribed for us. Unfortunately, I didn't get a really good look at that name at the plate. But yeah, as Storyman Jack points out, yeah, Howard and Lovecraft were very good friends via letters, and I believe they've actually written books full of nothing but their collected correspondence.
I think there have been printed 2 or maybe 3. I think it's 2. It could be 3 volumes of their correspondence by the Robert E. Howard Press. I don't know if they're still available. I think they might be out of print. If so, they need to get a new batch going here soon, because but basically all of their correspondence has been printed, or at least all known correspondence, at least to my awareness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they did have very differing worldviews. Howard was very much of the savage, noble, almost, barbaric man.
And the cyclical nature of civilization.
Mm-hmm.
How there is a period of civilization, but then there is some kind of collapse, typically after the civilization has decayed from within, then it's conquered from without. The conquerors become the new barbarians, then they themselves become civilized, and then rinse and repeat as they become corrupt. So to Howard, civilization was, as he said, it was a whim of circumstance. It was no natural state or anything like that. Whereas from Lovecraft's point of view, civilization was the ultimate goal of evolution and everything. That was mankind's natural state, that man just had to fight and elevate oneself in order to attain. And once there was very little to threaten that, apart from like ancient old ones and stuff like that. So there was the marked difference in their worldviews. And Howard, of course, also saw like then the British civilization as the height of civilization, whereas to Howard that was just one in a long list down the line that eventually would go the way of the dodo as well. So there was a conflict between them. And if history taught us anything, was that Howard was right.
It actually, yeah, I agree. Lovecraft was a bit of an Anglophile, and that is a recurring theme throughout a lot of Howard's books, is ancient civilizations which have crumbled and decayed, and frequently, especially in the Conan books, Conan will be forced to have to enter these ancient ruins of former civilizations where magic has gone bad and bad things are still lurking, in order to find whatever it is he's after. I believe you mentioned Jewels of Guaylur, that is one of those stories.
That's what I like about it. And yeah, it's when he comes in, gets a glimpse of something truly ancient with some ancient spell protecting it, a spell that very well might have gone awry. They did some, or Roy Thomas did some like fun takes on that in the comics. I forget the name of the issue, but there's like one story where it's Conan and his sidekick for the moment, and they come across this ancient tomb where there is said to be a huge diamond. And his partner in crime, he wants to go in, and Conan is like, "I've done this before. I mean, let the crypt keeper keep his diamond. I want none of it. Not worth it." Of course, he's convinced to go anyway. But lo and behold, it goes exactly as he predicted.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the comics. For a lot of people, I think the comic books, especially the original Marvel run with Roy Thomas, was kind of a lot of people's introduction to Howard.
They certainly were mine.
Mine too.
Yeah, only at a much later space, because you said you grew up with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't. I was aware of Conan growing up. It was like always there in the background. But when I first became a fan was as I did my master's at uni. and I just needed to read something else other than the hard academic literature. So I went into a local retailer and I picked up the Dark Horse reprints of the original Marvel comics, because those paperbacks had started coming out in those days. And I was like, oh yeah, Conan, maybe I should try reading this from the beginning. Since it's now from the beginning, it's recolorized, and I know that many people have issues with Dark Horse comics recolorization, but I have to say I freaking loved it. It was instrumental in me picking up that paperback to begin with, and being hooked were the choice of colors. But anyway, I just got it for fun, just to have something to diversify my reading. And 3 issues in, that was approximately halfway into the first paperback, I was blown away. So then I went and I got another, and another, and then I got all of the 7, which I think were available at that time, and I read them all back to back. And by that time, I was a fan that just had to read and learn everything about Conan, about Howard, and that's when I became the fan I was, because of the Dark Horse reprints of the Roy Thomas comics.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that. I had already been enjoying the Conan Marvel comics for years and years and years, and then when I got to college, and I was also having to read all the time, frequently, in between times waiting for classes, I would be kind of bored, and our comic book store here in town had closed down, so I kind of on a whim had picked up one of the big Conan original Robert E. Howard books. It was a collected volume which had, Tower of the Elephant and God in the Bowl and all these other stories. And I would read on that in between classes. And I just got immersed again in Conan. And the thing is, that was the first time I had actually read actual Howard Conan, because up until then I had only read the Conan comic books, and when I discovered just how rich the actual language and the writing was of Howard's original prose, I was just stunned. And I caught myself, reading it slowly or rereading passages of it over and over. It took me months to get through that volume. And my friends would ask me, well, what are you reading these days? And I would say, well, I'm still working on that volume of Conan. And they would say, well, why? Why are you still reading that after all this time? And I said, well, because I haven't necessarily finished it yet. And, he's not going to write anymore, so there's no reason to rush.
Exactly, and the thing is that you're going to discover more and more that you weren't aware of for each new reading of it. Because that's the thing with Howard stories. They're so chock full of historical references to other things in literature, like little subtleties of the story in the wording, things that's going to go way above most people's head at first glance. Because you can read them and just get like the top layer of the story. This certainly was the case with Elsbrig the Camp, who was instrumental in actually bringing Conan to the public with the Lancer editions and all of that, Lancer and later Ace.
Oh, yeah.
But he didn't understand that there's more to it. He even said this in a foreword: "Don't look for anything deeper. There isn't anything." Well, maybe he didn't see it, but it was there. And that's one of the fun things with Howard. Every time you read one of his stories, you can discover something new. And even the things that you thought you discovered, suddenly you discover a new layer to them.
Yes, definitely. A lot of people will say that, this author or that author is timeless. Howard is a timeless author. And the interesting thing is, I have noticed, I have gone back and read his stories at different points in my life, and it's strange how the context of my life fits the narratives in those stories in a different way. It makes me see different perspectives, and I don't know. I mean, and this is a pulp writer. I mean, it's worth mentioning that Conan was one of dozens and dozens and dozens of different characters that Howard wrote. He wrote westerns, he wrote boxing books, he wrote high adventure books. He wrote detective novels. He wrote everything. But Conan is his timeless work that everybody has fallen in love with and who he is remembered best for.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point, because Conan didn't just appear fully fleshed on the page one day. I mean, that's the work of someone who, despite his tender age at the time, was already a very, very experienced writer. Because the thing with that, yeah, you can say that he was a pulp writer, but to me, that is not any kind of a slur or an insult. Quite the contrary. I bet that most writers today, and then I mean like professional, really successful, established writers, if they suddenly were thrust back in time and they had to make a living through the pulps, they would have a hard time doing it. Because you couldn't make a living just writing one kind of story for one publication. You could do that and make a living from it. No, you'd really have to produce a ton of output. And not only a ton of output, a ton of different output. And through it all, you had to be a politician. You had to learn, each and every single editor at each magazine, what do they like and what do they not like. And this was one of the things that Howard did really well. He was able to realize, okay, this is the audience, this is the gatekeeper for that audience. How do I write so as to bypass that gatekeeper and actually develop a following among that audience? And to do that not just once, but multiple times over, and then keep the content coming non-stop. That takes skill. That takes some serious level of skill. So I think that pulp writers in general are extremely underrated. Yeah, of course, there's much schlock in the pulps. I'm not disputing that. Just as you have much comparatively schlock in writing shelves today. But among all that, there are some true gems that really, really hold up. And sometimes get a little bit of a bum rap just because they came from the pulps. When the fact of the matter is that that was the expression for popular and genre entertainment at the time. I mean, there was no YouTube. Movies weren't a dominant art form yet. They were only just in their beginning. You had the serials. Comics weren't really a thing yet, apart from like the funnies and newspapers. It was the pulps that were the prototype for all of this. I mean, the people that today are TV series writers, comic book writers, script writers, back in those days, they would all have been pulp writers.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Storyman Jack points out that he considers himself a new age pulp writer with his YouTube channel. Something
good for you. Kudos.
He is good. He's very good. But the thing with Howard is, it's like, you have modern writers. You were mentioning modern writers, guys like George R.R. Martin, who have to write these, massive, Bible-sized, thick books to tell their stories. I don't find them nearly as palatable as I do Howard, because Howard had to write shorter stories, and I think the length is actually better for me. Not just because, I'm necessarily attention deficit. I'm not. I'm attention deficit hyperfocus. But the thing is, the shorter lengths means that Howard had to tell more complete stories with less space to work with, as it were. And that, I think, is another kind of hallmark of his genius. And keep in mind out there, guys in the audience, Howard only lived to be 30 years old. So you can imagine that this is a guy in his 20s and he's producing these magnificent works. I mean, it's like, in my 20s, I wasn't doing anything like this. But, to produce writing of this quality at such a young age, even if it is in little short bursts of these pulps, it's so much more rich than a 500-page, George R. Martin novel. And I will stack Howard against Martin any day of the week, hands down.
Yeah, so will I, and I will take Howard against Martin any day of the week. But you hit on an important point there. Namely that it has to be shorter by nature. The stories don't have to be any less epic. The writers just have to be more economic about how they go about presenting those stories. Every single word matters. Now, of course, you do want to have a certain minimum of story and minimum of words so that you are even able to get paid, basically. And you also saw multiple of those stories, the longer ones, the ones that are basically novel length. They went across multiple issues. You have many stories that we know today as novels, but actually they were printed in the pulps in several installments. Like one example that's on my mind right now, because we did a watch party of it on Midnight's Edge Espanol last week, is The Mark of Sorrow. Mm-hmm. The Mark of Sorrow was the reprint novel title, but the original story was split up in the pulps, I think in 5 installments. And that made up like one full novel, basically. And the beauty is that, of course, there's some upper limits to how long it can be, but still it can be a fully fleshed out, great, full-length novel story. But at the same time, what there is not room for is for any writer to get lost in their own work. And that is what happened with George R. Martin. He allowed his creation to get the better of him, because he is more of a gardener who basically plants the story seeds, and he has like plans for the beginning, but then the story gets out of his control. The characters and the story kind of take on their own life that he documents, but he loses track of the bigger picture and the story. And because of that, he's probably never going to finish. What's the novel that he's working on right now? I mean, the Winds of Winter, is that it?
Yes.
Yeah, good luck seeing that come out. And after that is what? The Dream of Spring, which is going to be like twice as big. And he's been working on the Winds of Winter for what, 10 years now? And still nowhere in sight. And how long is he going to work on A Dream of Spring for? Another 20 years after that? I don't think he's going to live that long.
No, I don't either. And maybe that's the difference between Howard's writing and Martin's writing, is that Martin is in a very comfortable place where he has plenty of money. He doesn't really have to keep writing. Just the residuals and stuff he's getting from HBO, I'm sure, are paying for everything.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
But Howard had to write.
And also, I see that Ironcaster asks in the comments here, wasn't Dune in a similar fashion printed? Yes, it was. Dune also started out being printed in the pulps at the time, in the late 50s and early 60s. I don't remember the name of the publication or how many installments, but that also started out as installments printed in each issue over like 5-10 issues, something like that. But then it was expanded upon for the novel re-release. So there the novel is actually longer than the accumulated pulp version of it, which is actually rare because most of the time it is literally just the pulp story, which is compressed into one book with no real changes. But he actually did expand upon the novel version of Dune compared to the original pulp version of it. So that's one example. You could also see in the later Dune books that he too also kind of got lost in the story a little bit, because the books, they get progressively longer and longer without necessarily becoming any better. They're still great. Frank Herbert was a great writer.
Oh yeah.
But it's not that each new Dune book is better than the previous one. That's just not the case.
No. And I love Herbert, but yeah, pretty much the first Dune book is still definitely the best.
Yes.
And Storyman Jack comments that Robert Jordan was asked to write the Conan universe and publicly stated he would do it, but not to expect the beauty of Howard. I want to point that out. I remember those Jordan books because I was still very young at the time and still reading the comic books. And, you know, at that time, you could go to grocery stores and there would be novels on the in the magazine racks and stuff. And I remember seeing the Robert Jordan books and picking them up, and I must have been about 10 or 11. So here I am, 10 or 11, and I'm trying to read Jordan's Conan. And I think that kind of poisoned the well for me because, as I like to put it, Jordan wrote a really, really interesting fantasy book, and it just happened to have Conan in it because I didn't really see much of Conan in the work. Jordan, it seemed to me, spent more time writing about the other characters, especially, you know, the quote-unquote bad guys. And that really turned me off of reading Conan novels and literature. And like I said, it wouldn't be until I finally went to college and picked up my first actual Howard novel to rekindle the flame and you know, wake me up to how good of a writer Howard really was. You know, and I know that Conan is still a good property, and there's still a lot of guys who've attempted to take that on. You know, John Maddox Roberts and all these other various authors. Andrew J. Offutt, I think, also wrote some Conan.
Yes, he did. He did, and the best ones of those were, of course, adapted by Roy Thomas for the Savage Sword of Conan, like Conan and the Sorcerer and Conan and I forgot the name of it right now. It was like basically 3 stories. One where Conan lost his soul. It was pretty stupid, to be honest. It took Roy Thomas to make it good.
Yeah, but you know, and I think this is kind of a disservice to Howard. I mean, on the one hand, I can appreciate that people want to carry on his legacy and write about his character, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, I think anybody who really wants to explore Conan or wants to read Howard needs to read the original Conan stories written by Howard first before anything else, because you won't appreciate the other stuff nearly as much, or at least you won't see how derivative it really is until you read the original stuff.
I agree completely, because there's the Howard canon, which are all of Howard's original stories, and then it's everything else, and everything else technically is pastiche, all of it. However, some of those pastiches are incredibly good, and I'm personally of the opinion, this is just my opinion, that the best Conan stories outside of Howard's original stories aren't in book form. You won't find them from Robert Jordan, a great author in his own right, not so much for Conan or from Offutt or anything like that, but they're in the pages of the comic books. Both the original run of Marvel Comics, at least, especially if they were written by Roy Thomas and by Chuck Dixon, the two of them were the ones that really excelled it and expanded Conan to a whole new audience. Some of the other writers that were attached over the years, they're maybe not so much. And also in Dark Horse, you had some really, really good runs there, especially Kurt Busiek's run. Again, I don't know how you pronounce it. And also today with Jim Sub in the current Marvel Comics run. To me, those guys, they do really amazingly well because, like Howard himself, they're kind of like pulp writers, because in being comic book writers, they are used to writing a ton of completely different kinds of stories for different kinds of audiences. They have to be adaptive. They have to learn kind of like the Bible of what they're doing right now for the next few months. They have to familiarize themselves with what came before. And then they have to find a way to move the story forward that is consistent with what came before. Now, this is a trait that is, I'm not going to say that is completely unique to comic book writers, but comic book writers are much more likely to have that skill than, for instance, a writer of a novel who do their own things, and suddenly they are told to play in someone else's playbox. That might not work very well. Whereas a comic book writer writes in someone else or plays in someone else's playbox most of the time, and they have to learn to play with that someone else's rules. Which is why I think that outside of Howard's original stories, the best Conan stories are in the comics.
I would agree. And this is a map that is hanging up in Howard House. I want to point out that Howard House is tiny, by the way, guys. The hallway is very narrow, so if you see a lot of these pictures are slanted at angles, that is because I'm a big fella, and the hallways are narrow. So I couldn't line up the picture the way I wanted to, because otherwise I'd have been crushed into pictures on the other side of the hallway. And from this tiny little house, came this huge imagination. But this map, there's lots of Hyborian age maps you'll see, and there's all these places on it. Ophir, Zingara, Argos, Kos, Stygia, Keshan, Zimbabwe. All these places taken from real places in some extent, but it reimagined as fantasy locations. And what Roy Thomas did was fabulous. Him and Chuck Dixon, they showed us all these other places on the Hyborian map where Howard couldn't take us because he's already gone by that point.
Yeah, and something else that I really like about that map is the location of Cimmeria, a word that I just hate. In my mind, it has always been Chimeria. That's how it's how you're supposed to say it. That's how Conan would say it. But due to the rules of the English language, Cimmeria it is. But anyway, the location of Cimmeria is kind of like midway between the coast of Norway and Scotland. That's kind of like where the fictional Cimmeria is. The really cool thing, is that when you go back through the geological record, if you go far enough thousands of years back in time, the map actually kind of looked something like that. It was one continuous landmass. And then the North Sea and everything like that only came later as the ice shrunk after the Ice Age and landmass shifted and stuff like that. So that's pretty cool. He kind of got that bit right.
Yeah. And I do recall you saying that Conan was a proto-Celtic, and therefore, as we pronounce, Celt with a hard K instead of a soft C, then Chimeria would have been a more proper way to pronounce it. And
yes, it would. And if you also look at the historical Chimeria, it's also with a hard. It's also with a hard C, because you just have to realize that the soft C, that's a relatively modern invention for the English language. Historically, it was only hard K. I mean, at some point, some people wanted to remove the S from the alphabet, or remove like the ordinary K. Sorry, remove the ordinary K for the alphabet, because the C, the hard C, served that purpose. If you go back to the Romans, for instance, it was always when it was C, it was pronounced K always. And this is also includes the one we today call Caesar. The emperor, his name wasn't Caesar. If you went back in time to Rome and you asked to be presented to Emperor Caesar, they would have no idea who you were talking about. His real name, how it was pronounced, was Caesar. And that's and from his name is where the term Kaiser, meaning emperor in Germanic languages, came from. And also Tsar in Russian also came from his name. So the proper, historically correct pronunciation of Cimmeria is Chimeria. It always was. So it's just like a fluke of the English language that we kind of say it incorrectly in Cimmeria. But Conan himself would have said that I'm Conan from Chimeria and not Sonan from Cimmeria.
And
just a pet peeve of mine, sorry.
No, I agree with you totally. And it's funny, until you mentioned it on one of your retrospectives, I didn't realize it. And I was like, oh, that is really good observation. And actually, after I dug into it a little bit, something interesting happened. After Marvel lost the property temporarily and Conan went to Dark Horse, which, by the way, the Dark Horse run is fabulous. Oh my gosh. If you guys out there...
so good.
So good. It is the best.
It lost its way a little bit wrong in the middle there. Then it picked up a little bit towards the end. But, oh my God, it started so good. I mean, it started better than any other Conan run, honestly.
I agree.
Kurt Busiek, what he did there in like those first 5 or 6, 7 storylines, it was unparalleled. I mean, they're the best Conan comics ever, were the ones that he wrote.
Yeah, and kind of branching from that, Gary Nord and Kurt Busiek, what they did that was so awesome was they attempted to put the Conan stories in kind of a chronological order of the actual Robert E. Howard books, and they made them connect in a very organic way, because you had like the Lotus Eaters with the Frost Giant's daughter, etc. One narrative flowed into the other to form a continuous story, which I thought was really awesome.
Yeah. You actually could do Roy Thomas tried something similar, but you just have to work a hell of a lot harder to see it, because the stories that he wrote were kind of like out of order. So Roy Thomas, he suggested one chronology, which is wrong. And then fans have made another one, which is more correct. And if you follow that one, you can actually read all of the Marvel stories in a similar fashion. And they sync up pretty well. I'll be happy to send you the order later if you want it.
Definitely.
And it was basically the same ideas. You can actually do a chronological retelling if you really go and completely shift the order of all of the Marvel comics, put Savage Sword and everything around, you'll end up with a similar result. But it was done in a much more organic fashion in the Dark Horse run, because like on one extreme, it's actually like the adaptations of those Offit novels, because it was like 20 years between part 1 and part 2 of one story.
Kind of jumping back to what you were saying about Proto-Celtic, one of the things that Gary Nord's art did, along with Conan Online and all this other stuff, was they presented Conan with a kilt or a skirt type thing, like in this illustration by Timothy Truman, and that lends a lot of credence to your proto-Celtic theory, which I'm actually all on board with, because up until this point, pretty much everybody had come to recognize and expect the Conan that was created by John Buscema, which was the fur underpants and the giant, massive, overly exaggerated physique.
Yeah, so like if you are a bear and you come across Conan when he needs a change of outfit, watch out.
You're gonna be his new furry loincloth.
Exactly. Which is a really cool look, but yeah, I also think that the look for the Dark Horse comics was probably the more accurate one.
Mm-hmm. The other thing too, since it's worth mentioning, Buscema, created that giant, super heroic, muscle man figure of Conan, but that's not actually accurate to the books, because in the books he is described as a youth who is rangy and strong and tall, and I think that Robert E. Howard actually based his appearance of Conan on oil field workers that he saw, because of course if you worked on an oil field, you had to be very strong, but you also had to be fairly dexterous, because those tools and things are heavy, those tool sections, and of course with all that stuff flying around, you could get killed real easily.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, the popular image that we have of Conan, which is basically like the Schwarzenegger image of Conan, Howard definitely did not have that in mind. There did not exist a person with that kind of physique on the planet at the time when Howard wrote his work. Of course, you look at like the old Greek statues of the bodybuilders, you obviously had like a physique like that, but a physique like someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger, that didn't happen literally until Arnold Schwarzenegger. He may have been the first person in history to attain a physique like that. Because also how he is described depends a little bit on in what part of Conan's life the story takes place, because the stories were written out of order, and they follow Conan from a 15-year-old to a man in his 40s, which is where like the original stories kind of leave off, at which time he is a king. And you are right in that description of him as tall, but not really massive yet. But that's from the Tower of the Elephant. I recognize the description there. And at that time, he's about 15, so he still hasn't attained his full size. Not necessarily in height, but certainly in muscle mass. So he will become more bulky as time goes by. But yeah, you are right that Howard probably imagined him as the leanest and the strongest of men working on the oil fields, rather than Schwarzenegger. So that picture that we see right now, that's probably a very good approximation of something of what Howard might have imagined.
This is actually from the very first issue of the Conan comic book from Marvel, and this is done by Barry Windsor Smith, and he would keep this look for Conan throughout that run of his run. And I think this is probably the most accurate Conan in the comic books, other than the Dark Horse run, because here you can see that he is, while he's very muscular still, he's not the exaggerated, overproportioned bodybuilder style. He's a man of action. He has to be able to move. And, even now we see, modern MMA guys competing and stuff like that. Those guys are cut and they're strong, but they are not over bulky. They're not huge. They're not massively muscled, because they couldn't fight very well with all that extra bulk getting in their way. So I think this version of Conan is probably, closer to the truth, and it is probably still my favorite version of Conan outside of what Gary Nord did for Dark Horse.
Barry Windsor Smith, who did that artwork, he really did amazing in his on his run of the original Marvel comics. I mean, that's actually a big part of the reason why I fell in love with the stories. One thing was the writing of Roy Thomas, where he, just like the best of Pulp writers, adapted his writing style to fit the audience of Conan. So he did like subtle things that he didn't do on anything else. Like, for instance, there's no onomatopoeia in the Conan stories. They were filled of them in all the other Marvel comics, but not there, because he knew what audience he was catering to, just like Howard did. And then he wrote in Howard's style, which he only got better and better at. And then, of course, it was the artwork, first by Barry Windsor Smith, who set the stage. And then, of course, later you had John Buscema, who just took it to a different level. And then to me personally, and this is something that I know that old school fans will disagree with, but to me it was also the colors, the changed colors in the Dark Horse reprints, which is how I first were introduced to them, and they were instrumental in me picking it up to begin with. But like that trio right there is what to me became Conan, and how I came to discover Howard from it.
Yeah. Gosh, I don't actually have a Dark Horse image loaded up, unfortunately, but I probably should have. I was getting ready for this, and I didn't even think about it. But
oh, I'm sure people can find it, or it can be re-uploaded later. But anyway, just to go for look for Kurt Busiek's Conan, and there will be no shortages of what you'll find of his amazing digitally painted artwork with Conan in the what's it called again? That particular cloth? Kilt? Is that it?
Kilt.
Yeah, the kilt. Which I think is spot on, absolutely spot on.
Yeah, and if you want to read the Dark Horse comics, Marvel is reprinting all of them in omnibus now, so you can actually go back and read the good ones. And oh look, Storyman Jack has something. Perhaps continue this conversation on a segment of Midnight's Edge. Andre, I am at Andre's disposal if he wants to have me on for some more Conan talk.
Oh, I'm sure we can sort that out. I'm sure we can sort that out, especially when the Netflix series gears up a little bit. Last I heard from Fredrik Malmberg himself, they now had a showrunner. I suspect that the reason that no more information was revealed during Howard days was that it's simply too soon, because they locked down a showrunner just months ago, and he's probably busy typing away script, so it's just too early to reveal anything. But fingers crossed that turns out great. I am optimistic. And then we'll have loads of more current Conan stuff to talk about. So yeah, that would be awesome. Yeah.
Well, as a lot of you out there probably know, Robert E. Howard had a very short life. That is because he chose to take his own life at the age of 30. After probably quite a lot of depression and things related to his mother's illnesses. In fact, I think she had fallen into a coma, basically, and was not going to recover from it, and he decided he couldn't live without her. I mean, he was so attached to her that he took his own life. The lady at the museum was kind enough to allow me to go behind the rope and take this photograph. This is a replica. This is an Underwood typewriter, the same kind he would have used. And on that page are his very last words, as he would have left them. Which I think I can actually remember from heart is all fled, all done, and now the lamps expire. Now lift me on the pyre.
Something to that effect, yeah. The light goes out, the flames expire. Take me to the pyre. Something to that effect, yes. Which are beautiful last words. But again, it only goes to show kind of like the dual nature of his mother. Without her, he wouldn't have been the great writer that he was,
Mm-hmm.
we wouldn't have the wealth of stories that we have now, that will endure far beyond him and any of us. His work will carry on after all of us are gone. And she deserves part of the credit for that, because she's the one that continued to motivate him and to teach him, and perhaps inadvertently give him like life lessons that he could apply in his writing. At the same time, no one has said that, but I'm going to say it's very, very clear from the writings and from the research, from everything we've learned, for instance, from Mark Finn's excellent Howard biography, that Howard's mother was a mean, vindictive, bitter, abusive woman.
Mm-hmm.
She was mean to her husband, and she was mean to Howard. He might not have seen it that way, but obviously she was. She was able to transmit her own depression onto him, probably by non-stop complaining about how horrible it was, how unjust it was that she would be saddled with such a useless man as Howard's father, who was a hardworking doctor.
Mm-hmm.
But still, she saw herself as coming from the upper echelons of society. And that's where she felt that she belonged. That was her birthright. But she had married wrong. Evidently, none from that upper echelon of society wanted her. So she married Howard's father, the physician, a catch by any standards, but not to her. So instead of being grateful and making a home, she proceeded, by all accounts, to create misery wherever she went, and ended up bedridden. Don't really know what was her problem. I'm sure depression was a great big part of it. And in being so abusive, probably the entirety of Howard's life, she made him completely dependent on her, to the point that he couldn't function without her. This is the opposite of what any parent should do.
I agree.
So there's like the double-edged sword, that she no doubt made his life worse. But if she hadn't, we wouldn't have his writing legacy. And yeah, if he had been strong enough to move on, if nothing else for his father, who then lost his wife and his son on the same day, or well, technically 2 days apart, but still. But yeah, that's like that, and that's always something that's going to be like a shade in his memory and in his legacy. It's how horrible his mother was.
His mother was written considerably more sympathetic in the movie The Whole Wide World, which was shot actually on a studio stage or in parts of Austin, including their Paramount over there. Something I wanted to point out is that Storyman Jack says he was 10 years old and his father bought him this manual typewriter. It's the very model that Howard used. That picture makes you tear up. Let me tell you what, Storyman Jack. I wept openly and freely at that museum, especially standing over this typewriter. I told my producer, I said, we're never going to have another person like this. We're never going to have anyone like this again. But, my producer, being the cool guy that he is, he said, that's all right. We'll still have his stories, and new people will discover Howard, and maybe you'll play some small part in that, with your video. And I hope I do. I hope that other people will embrace Howard's work. I mean, certainly Conan, the most easily accessible of all of his work, but also his other books. Del Rey is reprinting all of his stuff. They have reprinted all of it, and I have a lot of that collection. But Solomon Kane, who I think we're going to get another Netflix by him. I'm not sure.
Well, we don't know that it's on Netflix. What we know is that they are internally developing it. That we know. Netflix has formally not picked it up yet. It's natural to think that they would be the ones to do it, but last I heard, Solomon Kane was being internally developed at Cabinet Entertainment. Then they'll make a package, and they'll present that to takers. And then it would be most beneficial if Netflix were to pick it up. But we're not there just yet. But with any luck, hopefully we will be before long.
Yes. Well, and there are always comic books, which Marvel has reacquired the rights. Thankfully, because of the people who own Howard or Conan's rights, they can't mess with that character, so he's going to be okay. He's still going to be Conan, no matter what kind of situation they put him in.
Yes, thank God for that. And you can totally tell also in Savage Avengers, which is the comic that has loads of people groaning out loud, because that is Conan running around in the contemporary world, fighting alongside Venom and Deadpool and the Punisher in the contemporary Marvel universe. And many expressed that they were afraid of just that happening. But there's 2 points to that. One is that that's not the main Conan comic book. That's like a fun other thing on the side. But you know what? It's actually really, really fun and cool.
Yes.
And Conan is Conan in it. He isn't chickened down in any way, shape, or form. I mean, he'll do all the kinds of stuff that you thought that you can't get away with in Marvel Comics these days. Conan is still Conan, and that is because, as you say, Marvel don't own Conan. They can't do what they want with him. Every single issue has to be approved by the rights holder. And the rights holder is the very sound Fredrik Malmberg, who can give notes and everything, but he's been very clear in advance with what he wants. So, from what I haven't spoken with the writer of Savage Avengers, but I have spoken with Jim Sub, who does the regular Conan run, and they seem to have a very good workflow going on there.
Yes, I have to admit, Savage Avengers is kind of a guilty pleasure of mine. And believe me, Punisher and Conan teaming up was kind of a dream for me because I'm a big Punisher fan too. I'm kind of sad at how it turned out. I think they could have done more with that. I think they left a lot of stuff on the table with that story. But you know, take it as it is. It's fun. Yeah,
I think they made up for it when Conan and Deadpool decided to break out of prison.
Yeah, that was a good. Or actually, I loved it when Conan sat down to dinner with Victor Von Doom. That was hilarious.
That was fantastic. That's two noble men. One a king in his own right, and someone else destined to be king, but who still has the greatness of a king. And Doom recognized that.
Mm-hmm. The Zub comic books are pretty good. I loved Jason Aaron's run on it. I'm generally a fan of Jason Aaron for the most part. I think he's a great writer. I think he does a good Conan. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's the comic books. There's the Del Rey reprints of all of Howard's work. And I guess we need to have that conversation about the movies.
Yes.
Oh my. 1982, I will argue with anybody, was the best year in cinema history. You had so many memorable, great productions. You had Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. You had The Thing. You had Blade Runner. And you had Conan the Barbarian. And I saw that, I want to say I was about 10, maybe 11 years old. Not in the theater, of course, because it was rated R. But back then, we had cable television, and back then parents worked as they do now, and of course, television was the great babysitter back then as cell phones are now. And coming home from school, you could catch Conan the Barbarian on HBO or Showtime or something. And I remember seeing it for the first time. I was so enthralled with that film. And honestly, I have never, ever seen a sword and sorcery film that can top that one. It is so viscerally real. I mean, yeah, the blood just flows all over the place when Conan hits people, even though, you can tell that he's not making any deep impact on his hits.
For the time, that was a very violent movie, from what I understand. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, the costuming was so good. The set pieces were just so good. The acting, even, say what you will about Schwarzenegger, I think he played that part very well. I mean, it was a simple part, but it just kind of required him to be big and on screen. But it worked.
It was rewritten to that end, because the Oliver Stone script, the original script that they started developing the movie from, that was a script that required more in terms of acting and intensity. But by the time Arnold Schwarzenegger came, by the time John Milius came on, Arnold Schwarzenegger was already on. So John Milius knew that, okay, this is the guy I have to work with. So in addition to tailoring the script in his own fashion, which was getting rid of some of the more supernatural elements of it, he included the riddle of steel as the thematic point of the movie, but he also changed the role of Conan to be much more quiet and to have the story basically told to him while he's a passive part of it, because he knew, okay, like, Schwarzenegger looks great, so let's all look at him and not having say any more than strictly necessary. So it's not like that there was a script and he happened to be right for that script. The script was altered to become right for him by not having him speak more than strictly necessary.
And I think it's a credit to John Milius. I have seen the original draft of Oliver Stone's script with the demons fighting demons and all that other bullshit, and I said, that's not Howard.
Yeah, no, it got a little lost towards the end there. But I will say at the beginning, it was very much so Howard, when you had like the references to him being crucified and the different roles of Valeria and Thulsa Doom in it. But yeah, that script was obviously just like a first draft. It was never meant to be a shooting script. It was meant to sell the movie, to attract talent, and to start getting licensing deals and everything. That was the purpose of that script. It was never going to be filmed in that exact way.
Mm-hmm. And something you point out is Thulsa Doom. Thulsa Doom was actually a Cull villain who had a skull for a head, if I'm not mistaken, and he's basically the basis.
That is entirely correct, yes.
And he's the basis for Skeletor in Masters of the Universe.
Yeah, pretty much. No, because what happened was that, as I said, that original script, that was what they used to attract talent and deals and everything like that. So they had like this whole package. They had the script, they had illustrations, and because they had the rights to Cull, then they could pick and choose anything they wanted. And what Oliver Stone wanted from there was the villain Thulsa Doom, because he's really visually striking. He's a necromancer that can look like a human when he decides that's beneficial to him, but that's just a ruse. His true form is having a fleshy body, but a skull face, the image of death, which we today know as Skeletor. And of course, this image and everything was given to Mattel, the toy company, when they tried to pitch like a He-Man, not He-Man, that's what it became, a Conan toy line, which of course Mattel eventually decided to walk out on after first having agreed to it and creating molds and everything, but then they Then they walked out after Milius came aboard, and it was clear that half the molds and everything that they had wasn't going to happen anymore. And then mysteriously, sometimes later, then suddenly the He-Man line shows up. And He-Man, in his original incarnation in the mini-comics, has exactly the same story as Conan. He's literally a barbarian that wanders away from his village to discover the world, basically. And then, of course, there's Skeletor, who happens to look just like the original image of Thulsa Doom. So yeah, good going.
Yeah. I don't know why they didn't choose Thothamon, because clearly that is who James Earl Jones's character was supposed to be.
Yeah, actually, that was a coincidence. It's not that they tried that. I thought that too. Like, why don't we just call him Thothamon when clearly that's who it is? But actually, the reason that he's not there is that John Milius, who wrote the script, he never read any of Howard's original stories. He didn't know. You could go up to him and you can say, why don't you use the Thulsamon? And he would answer, who's that? What he had to work with was the original Oliver Stone draft. And he write that to fit his own personality and his own vision. But that was just a starting point. He didn't add anything from Howard that wasn't already there. So the name Thulsa Doom is what continued to be there, because that's what was there from Oliver Stone. And the reason why he looks more like Thothamon is because they combined the Snake People with Thulsa Doom as the drafts changed. But that was actually more of a coincidence. It wasn't an effort to make him more like Thothamon. I'm surprised that none of the other producers or anyone that were more closely associated decided that maybe we should change the name to Thothamon, because that's who this guy is now, or at least the one he's closer to. But I guess Milius had fallen in love with the name Thulsa Doom.
It worked out. Definitely, that movie is worth seeing.
Yes, one of the greatest movies ever. Like, say what you want as a fan of Conan. Like, I have issues with it from that point of view, but it's a great movie. No one can take that away from it. Maybe not Conan, but great it is.
I'm guessing your issue is the same as mine, as Conan the Slave.
Of course. Which is as un-Conan as it can possibly be.
Yes. Although it is a good way to compress a lot of time on Conan, especially since you're doing an origin story, as they were. It is still problematic in that, yeah, Conan would not be a slave for long. Not by his very nature.
Yeah, I disagree a little bit that it's an origin story. You can raise that objection against the 2011 reboot. There it was meant to be a condensed origin story. But the issue with John Milius' movie is that not only is it the origin movie and the franchise starter, it ends on such a definitive note that it's also inadvertently the franchise ender.
That's true.
Because there's really nowhere else for him to go. It ends, or it begins, with the audience being presented to the riddle of steel. And then it ends with him thinking, and although this isn't really spelled out, the audience is meant to understand that now he just solved the riddle of steel. And now that riddle is solved, everything is possible to him. So eventually he's going to become king of his own hand. Mm-hmm. The end. That was the end of the story. That line towards the end there, and that story too shall be told. That's something that was actually added for the extended version that was released on DVD and Blu-ray in when was it? Was it like 2003 or something like that? That's when that line was added. It wasn't there in the original version.
I didn't know that. Yeah, this is the scene, obviously, with King Conan.
And here's like the thing. So that's not a promise of movies to come, because John Milius told his movie. And it was a great standalone movie, but it's not one that lent itself to sequels in any way, shape, or form. It was like too final for that. If you just look at it thematically, that whole movie has run its course. That was kind of the issue with it. It did its job all too well.
I agree.
It might as well have been called Conan: The Beginnings and the End Game.
True. And I think a lot of us probably wished it hadn't gone on. But yeah, if we're looking at Conan movies, we got to look at the sequel. And wow. Oh my gosh. You know.
It's Conan the Destroyer. And that title is certainly ironic, because he wasn't so much a destroyer in the movie, but it certainly was a destroyer of the franchise.
Yes, unfortunately. Now, that one I did have the pleasure of seeing in the cinema. And as I recall, I must have been about 12, maybe 13 at the time.
Well, it's target audience then.
Yeah, unfortunately. And I also remember the audience, or the auditorium, the theater itself being mostly kind of empty when I went in there. You know. And
how long had it already been out by the time you saw it?
A few weeks, I think.
So it should have been. Should there have been more or less people, given that it had been better received?
I figured there would be more people, just because it's Conan, and the first one was so good, it was so well received. I mean, Raffaella De Laurentiis was talking about how they had people lined up around the block to see the first Conan movie. I mean, bikers and everything were just showing up to watch this movie. So I, of course, thought like, well, the second one, people are going to mob that theater, and yeah, when I got there, not too many people in the actual theater itself. I think it was just myself and my parents and maybe just a few other people here and there, but it really wasn't that many people. And then when I saw the film, I understood why. Because while it is a very fun sword and sorcery romp, it is really not Conan.
No, it is not. And the story of why it's not is actually tragic, because it could have been. It could have been Conan, because it was co-written by Roy Thomas and one of his comic book co-patriots. I forget his name right now in the second. The guy who also co-created the Punisher, and
Jerry Conway.
Thank you, Jerry Conway. And I was about to say, and has gone off his rockers a little bit in recent years. but before then, at this time, he was still a very good writer. And you look at the initial draft that they handed in, and it wasn't supposed to be called Conan the Destroyer at that time. At that time, it was called Conan the King of Thieves, or something to that effect. I think that was the original title. Then it was changed to the Horn of Azoth or something like that later on. Anyway, their first Dagoth. Thank you. Azoth was the comic book adaptation of the story. Dagoth was, of course, the movie version. But anyway, their original story wasn't half bad. No, it still needed a little bit more work, but there absolutely was something there. Because the challenge after the John Milius movie was that he had done a too final job ending it. So they kind of would have to, like, I'm not going to say reboot it, but they have to start off in a different direction and kind of like re-establish, okay, we want to make a franchise here. So this is what we're doing now. And then leave it on like a more of a cheerful ending where you want to come back for more adventures. So that was kind of like the goal. Unfortunately, that movie was micromanaged when head producer Dino De Laurentiis. Yeah, Raffaella might have been the producer in name, but in actual reality, she only had the power that Dino wanted her to have. And And when he had been told by Universal that, hey, if you go and you make this movie here PG instead of R, we're going to earn so much more money. And then you get so much more money too. So that was like one thing that really went wrong. The studio were the one that decided that, you know what, we're really, really happy with how the first movie performed. We think we can do better if the second one is PG. Well, that was a mandate. That was a big red flag right there. You can still do a good movie within that. I mean, Indiana Jones was within that.
Mm-hmm.
If they had gone with something closer to the original Roy Thomas and Jerry Conway script, I think we would have gotten a much better movie for it. But Dino De Laurentiis, he also felt that that script needed work. Unfortunately, he gave it the wrong kind of work.
Yes.
And for each passing rewrite, it got worse and worse to the point where Conway and Roy Thomas could no longer live with it. So they decided to leave the project because this wasn't something that they were happy to be associated with. And then Dino De Laurentiis got someone else in to work from their last and most terrible draft and just finish it up with his most recent batch of notes, making it a poorly gobbled together Frankensteinian abomination of a script. And that's what they filmed. And then the results were, of course, as expected.
Yeah, the funny thing is the original Conan the Barbarian film was made on a budget of $20 million, but Destroyer was made on an $18 million budget. Now, of course, the first Conan brought in almost 4 times what it cost to make it, whereas Conan the Destroyer barely made over its budget. And I remember the film, despite the fact, the advance in, in time and everything looks cheaper in Destroyer.
Yeah, I think there's several reasons for that, but I think that one of the things was that it was more ambitious than it should be. It was more ambitious than there were money to be able to pull that vision off.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, you had an all-star cast. Well, all-star is kind of pushing it. You had a cast of really interesting characters to travel along with Conan, but to me, all that did is it just kind of seemed like Conan and the Super Friends.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point, actually. And that's something that was there in the original script, so you can't really... you have to give some of that blame to Thomas and his partner in crime. But the nature was very different, though, because there, in the original version, Conan didn't really have any friends there. He was kind of like thrust into a situation where he had to deal with these people, but he was an outsider even in that situation. And of course, that changed radically from script to screen. But it's interesting what you say about the sets and the effects, because that's actually something that is massively to John Milius' credit. He wanted the whole thing to be grounded. He wanted it to be real. So all of the really supernatural, out there aspects of the original Oliver Stone draft, we got rid of those.
Mm-hmm.
And then he kept some in there. You have some supernatural things, but most, certainly the sets, it's really grounded sets that aren't too easy or too difficult to build, and that you can build and have them look very, very real. Something that you wouldn't question that this couldn't exist. Whereas in Destroyer, there, the director, Richard Fleischer, he didn't put up any fight or something. He did the movie that he was expected to make. And the movie that he was expected to make was one that was just a tad too ambitious for what they were able to pull off. And instead of him putting his foot down and saying, no, we have to change this. We can't have this thing in the middle of the lake because we can't make it look good. or we can't have this part of the set that looks like a jar or something because it's going to look stupid. We have to change it to something that's going to work on screen that we can actually build. So we have an actual prop, and that prop has to look real. He didn't do that.
Nope.
So he went with filming things that were just too ambitious. And the worst, of course, is Dagoth himself when he first appears. I mean, oh my God, like that movie monster right there. I said it before and I'll say it again. That's something that belongs in a Japanese Godzilla movie of the 60s. It does not freaking belong in a sword and sorcery movie of the 80s. And yet, maybe if it's an Italian sword and sorcery movie, I mean, the Italians had a spiraling film industry. They could do something like that in like one of their halfway softcore porn movies. You could do that there. You could leave it to like the Barbarian brothers. It would fit right in there. But having that kind of bodysuit monstrosity appear on screen in a sequel to John Milius' Conan the Barbarian. I mean, if the audience weren't lost before, they were definitely lost at that moment. And it doesn't matter that they had Andre the Giant play that thing, because you couldn't even see him. I mean, you could have a little person do that, and just filming him from like really, really close, he would like big and intimidating, because he wouldn't look big and intimidating either way, because it's just too crappy a rubber suit for it to work, no matter what you do.
It was a pretty underwhelming fight, really, too. I mean, all this build up to Dagoth, and then that was what you got. It was just kind of like, what the hell?
But, I mean, it's the most underwhelming fight since the battle with the Night King in Game of Thrones.
Oh man, and see that there's funny things to point out in Destroyer is the fact that there was so much magic in it, and I'm like, that's not Conan, that's not Howard, because in Conan, in Howard Conan, Howard is very clear. Magic is evil, and those who use magic are usually evil. And it's not, Conan always struggles against magic. And for there to be so much of it in the film was kind of like, what kind of story are you trying to tell here?
I mean, there's one way I could see them getting away with it. And that is if this had been the movie where Conan learned to hate and fear magic.
Yeah, that would have been good.
Yeah. If he ends it with like, the next time I see a wizard, I'll ask no questions. I'm just going to take his head off right away, because I'm having no more of this crap. Then it would have been worthwhile if you get like that moment. But you didn't, so it wasn't.
No, and oh man, can I mention this? But it's just like Arnold Schwarzenegger's wig really looked terrible in that film.
Yeah. Yeah, really did. All of it did. No, actually, he looked pretty. Like the wig was good, but or was bad, but his body looked good, because that's one thing that Richard Fleischer deserves credit for. That he wanted Schwarzenegger to be seen even more than Milius wanted. He wanted him to run around in the bare loincloth, much like he did in the comics. So much of the really iconic Conan imagery we have of Schwarzenegger is from that movie, and not the Milius movie, for that very reason. But yeah, I agree that wig didn't do anyone any favors, and it's very obvious why he was like wearing that bandana like thing.
Yeah, that headband thing.
Yeah.
One of the things I think was a disgrace to the script in the film also was they included a character that had no business being in there without context, and the fight that was involving that character also was just baseless. They had actor stuntman Pat Roach playing I don't remember the character's name, but I mean, at one point he's playing the man-ape, who's supposed to be Thak the man-ape from the Howard story.
And he's also Toth the Mon. So great way of destroying Toth the Mon and Thak at the same time.
Oh God, it was Thoth the Mon, wasn't it? Oh.
Yeah, it was Toth the Mon, and like I would have preferred if they just went with some random nameless thing instead of like ruining Totemon on it. But you can kind of like tell because he had like those horns in his outfit, which were an embarrassing version of what he had of with the horns that Totemon has in the Marvel comics.
But that story with Thak the Man-Ape in Rogues in the House is really good because, you know, you can tell Howard was inspired by Poe when he wrote that. You know, kind of bringing it back around to Howard. And that was a hell of a fight in the books. I mean, Conan almost died because Thak was so much more physically stronger than him and so much more, you know, barbaric and savage. I mean, it's like that was almost like that was Howard's what he was trying to convey was the fact that here is something that is even more savage than me. And even though they tried to tame him, it obviously failed, and this thing's going to kill me. But, you know, to see, you know, Pat Roach in a rubber mask fighting with Arnold Schwarzenegger in a glass room is kind of like...
And it's so stupid as well, because, yeah, okay, so the key to defeating him is breaking the mirrors. Well, why the heck does he choose to take the fight into a room of mirrors that's going to destroy him? He can't even throw Conan into one of them.
Yeah, plus, you know, and what I remember, Arnold Schwarzenegger really cut the hell out of himself on those, because those were real mirror glasses that he was cutting through.
Yeah, I don't recall that, but that could be. I'm not gonna. Very well could be. I mean, I'm sure it's much cheaper to use like real mirrored glass on that than some cheap replica or more expensive replica of it. I mean,
if you go back and you watch that fight scene where he's actually starting to shatter the mirrors, if you pause it on some of those swings, you'll notice that Schwarzenegger actually has blood on him, and that's not stage blood. That's his blood from actually getting cut with pieces of flying mirror glass. So obviously it was pretty dangerous to him too. Now, I mean, there were accidents that happened in the first movie too. I mean,
Schwarzenegger, he well, there was plenty injuries on set of that one. Sandal Bergman got the worst of it that we know of.
Yeah, her finger almost got cut off by a German stuntman.
Yeah.
But
also, that I just remember that was also something funny with in the first movie that was filmed in Spain. Mm-hmm. They had to pay the Spanish extras extra just to like be quiet and die with dignity, because they all wanted their moment in the sun, and they all had like these elaborate death scenes after they were like chopped down of like screaming and crying and epically dying, and they just had to be paid extra to stop doing that.
I do recall one of the stories that I saw back when I was a kid was that it was so cold on the location where they fought the Battle of the Mounds. It was so cold in Spain that day that the special effects guy, they were actually mixing vodka into the fake blood to stop it from freezing.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, depending on what time of year it is, Spain can be, or this is inland Spain, and inland Spain can be really freezing cold in addition to really boiling hot. So, yeah, time of year is everything there.
Yeah. We do have to mention that there was the Conan cartoon, which I did not ever get to see.
Conan the Adventurer.
Yes. Did you ever see
the first time the title was used? No, actually, no. I have never seen one full episode from beginning to end.
I do actually have a DVD collection of the Conan TV series that had German strongman Rolf Müller as Conan.
Yeah. He really fought to get that role. That's incidentally also called Conan the Adventurer. So, what have we learned? If something is called Conan the Adventurer, run fast and run far, and don't see it.
Yeah.
No, actually, for, the animated series, from what I hear, ain't half bad. I'm too old that I can start watching an animated children's show right now without me having some kind of childhood affection for it, like He-Man, and be able to sit through it. So yeah, I can like try an episode, but from what I gather from research, is that it has its moment, but you're better off reading the comics.
Definitely.
Yeah, and but then the Conan the Adventurer, the live action series, the one that lasted from 1997 for one season in 1997. What did you think about that? If you've seen it?
Oh, I have it. Yeah.
Yeah, but you can have it without. I have it, but I haven't seen all of it.
Oh no, I have it on DVD. I've watched it several times. It is a bit cringy. Rolf Muller does a passable job as Conan, but mostly it kind of still smacks of Conan and the Super Friends, because Conan travels with all these other characters, and of course the other characters get fleshed out a little bit. I particularly liked T.J. Storm in that. I can't remember what the name of his character was, but he would use martial arts because he's a martial artist in real life.
Yeah.
He
also had a really good death scene in Punisher Warzone, but that's neither here nor there. TJ Storm, that is.
Yeah, I remember that. It was okay. It wasn't, it was very schlocky. Obviously, they were trying to tap into that whole Hercules, Kevin Sorbo type thing.
Yeah. That's a sad statement of sword and sorcery in the 90s, because that Hercules, Cena, and that's what sword and sorcery was in the 90s, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. I guess we have to finally get to that 2011 Conan movie.
Yeah. Before that, though, I just want to say about the Conan the Adventurer. It had the best on-screen Red Sonja to date. And the one episode where Red Sonja she was pretty decent in it.
She was
more than the rest of the series, and she's the most comic book accurate Red Sonja we are ever likely to get, including the upcoming movie.
Yeah. Oh, I had almost completely managed to block out Red Sonja from my memory, but I do remember seeing the original in the theater. Once again, very few people in the theater, but the one with Brigitte Nielsen as Red Sonja. And of course, Conan, Schwarzenegger was really huge on the poster if you go back and see it.
Yeah, he was the main selling point, which is funny considering that he was contracted to do a cameo.
Yeah, and he almost ended up stealing the show. But I remember my profound disappointment at watching that film and discovering that Schwarzenegger was playing someone named Calidor, who was not Conan.
Yeah, that was Conan in name, or Conan in everything but name, completely needlessly. That was pain in the ass. It was very disappointing. But in a sense, though, if it had been Conan, then the whole movie would have been part of the Conan trilogy, and maybe it's better that it wasn't, because this way there's like one Conan movie that you can kind of forget, while you can just focus on how good The Barbarian was. I mean, if Red Sonja really had Conan, it would have like shifted the balance, wouldn't it? It would have been two horrible movies to one good one.
True. As it is, though, I think the Red Sonja movie kind of put the nail in the coffin.
It did, in more ways than one.
But anyway, yeah, the other nail in the coffin is probably the 2011 Conan.
Yeah, about that, I have to say that this was long before there was a Midnight's Edge, but I already was a Conan fan. And I also enjoyed observing the development of movies, like the movies that I was excited for. I would follow their development from their beginning all the way up to release. most of the time, in retrospect, it actually turned out pretty bad, because most of the movies I anticipated turned out to be pretty bad movies. But never was it as bad as with that one. And just following that was so painful, because it was so obvious so early on that that movie was going to be a complete train wreck. And just being there on the outside, powerless to do anything about it, and just seeing that they're doing this and this and this and that decision, and they're almost all going to end in disaster, was just frustrating and painful to observe.
Yeah, that
I just
film
want
had,
to, yeah, but anyway, that's my story. Your story. What's your story with that movie? How excited were you in advance, and when it came out, what did you feel?
wow. Well, I was kind of excited about it. I mean, it was the first Conan movie in years, and being a Conan fan, I thought, okay, this could be cool. And so my friend actually treated me and took me out to the theater to watch it. And I remember thinking when it first opened up, I was like, "Oh wow, man, this looks really good." I mean, the visuals are just spectacular, and I was kind of expecting that because I had seen Marcus Nispel before when he did Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I thought, "Wow, this guy really knows how to visually make things look awesome." And then Rose McGowan came on without her eyebrows, and I thought, how do you take a woman that is so beautiful as Rose McGowan and make her look so damn ugly? And then they were talking about, well, I mean, okay, from my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, but the basis of that movie is the Witch Queen of Acheron story, the novella that Howard wrote. Am I wrong?
I think so. It could be. I'd have to double check that. I don't think it came from anything that Howard wrote. I once had an interaction with the credited writers, and from what I gathered from them, maybe you are right. Maybe that's something that they started with, but to me, I got the impression that they were just kind of like doing a best of collection of the Savage Sword of Conan. And it could be that they came across that particular storyline in one of the Savage Sword of Conan stories, and they decided, let's use this as the starting point. And then we want to reference this, and we want to have him on the boat, and we want to have him be a pirate, and we want to do this, this, and that, because that's like the perfect summary and distillation of the Savage Sword of Conan comics. I think, I haven't researched this yet, but I think that's what the writers were going for.
There's not much reason to research it. It was a terrible film.
Well, I'm going to, because I'm doing a retrospective on it, and it reminds me I have to hurry up, because that movie soon has its 10-year anniversary, so I have to hurry up on that, and I have to do another one in between. So yeah, need to get rocking here.
Oh, you ever need any research, just let me know. But your the main bad guy was Stephen Lang as Kalar Zim, the warlord, and I'm like,
he wasn't the first choice for the role. The one that they wanted was Javier Bardem.
Ooh. That might have been interesting.
Yeah, I think that could have been interesting too. But they did get a very interesting actor to replace him. So the problem wasn't really any of the actors. The actors, they were all fine. It was everything else around that kind of didn't really work out there, in my opinion. But I may be getting ahead of myself. Carry on the story.
Well, first off, I got to say, Jason Momoa as Conan, he worked. He was taller. Obviously, he had the more rangy, muscular build. I mean, he's still muscular, but he is closer to what I could see Conan rather than the overbuilt Schwarzenegger. And And physically, more or less the I don't know, maybe the darker skin is a problem as compared to Conan, because Conan is typically kind of a lighter shade.
Well,
But
here's like the thing, that Conan is kind of like the one that I always want to play Conan is Henry Cavill. Henry Cavill will be spot on, because Conan, as he is described, is very much Henry Cavill, Gerard Butler type, like black Irish, black hair, white skin, blue eyes. But of course, Conan, he is described as suntanned. So Jason Momoa's complexion need not be an issue. I think the more important thing is basically his demeanor. And the beauty with Jason Momoa is that he really just have to be himself, and he can do a pretty decent Conan. What I felt was what was bad there was that they didn't give him blue-eyed contacts, because that is something that is really central to the character. I mean, he doesn't really have that many distinguishing visual features, but one of them is his steel blue eyes. Yes. And one of the things that the production said was that they're not going to bother the actor by having him wear contacts on sets. Instead, they're going to use CGI to make his eyes blue in post. That's something that had me worried, because I was like thinking, oh my God, they're gonna back out on that. It's so easy to say that now, and then come the movie to have completely backed out on it. And right enough, they said, no, if we try to do it with CGI, he would look like the Fremen in Dune, and we can't have that. So he's just going to have his own natural eye color. And I'm like, well, that's all hope of him looking like a Cimmerian out the window right there. Which, to be fair, though, I have to say that in terms of like being consistent across ages, because like the child actor who plays the young Conan, what a spot-on resemblance to Momoa. And also they had like a woman of significantly darker complexion to play his mother. So they did all of that right. I don't know where she came from, but she definitely wasn't Cimmerian. So that's fine. I would have liked to hear more about that. But in any event, yeah, fine. I'll buy him as Conan. But what I didn't buy, though, is that the lack of blue eyes and his curly hair. Like, if he had straight hair and blue eyes, he would have been perfect. As it was, Momoa was really good, so he wasn't the main issue there. Other issues with the movie would have made it bad no matter who played Conan.
True. And what's really sad about that is you did have some really stellar actors. Stephen Lang as Kalar Zim actually is a good actor. I've seen him in lots of things, and he's a very good actor. Ron Perlman as Conan's father.
Yeah, so good.
Now this is curious. Milius and apparently this guy from 2011 both have it as Conan's father is a blacksmith, and yet in all of the Howard stories, I don't ever really recall Conan's father being a blacksmith.
No, but they didn't read the Howard stories. They read the Savage Sword of Conan, and in them, Howard's father is established as a blacksmith.
Okay.
In Howard's original stories, we never really hear anything about Conan's father. We learn that his grandfather, he was someone from a southern tribe that had traveled, and so that inspired Conan to go traveling to see the world as well. That's all we learned about his family from Howard himself. But in the Savage Sword of Conan, we got to meet his sister and his mother and his father, whose name was, I believe, Corrin or something to that nature, and he was the village blacksmith. So again, that's where they took it from, because they did a best of collection of the Savage Sword of Conan comics. And they failed to get any of the best bits, or package them in any kind of good way.
Yeah, that movie was all over the place, literally.
By design, because they wanted to kind of like, instead of telling one story, one consistent story, and do it great, like Dredd, they decided, hey, let's do this like a comic book movie of the 90s. when the movie has to be like the absolute best of version of all the comic book storylines. So we have to throw everything in there into this one movie and thereby mess up every single great storyline there is. Which is why he had to be a pirate in there for some reason and bring in the boats that all had nothing to do with the rest of the story.
Now, I mean, yeah, if they're going to do the pirate thing, the one thing that pisses me off about that, and this is something that is in the comic books too, they didn't bring in Bayleet, which I thought they should have.
Well, would have gotten in the way of his love interest in this one.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
But and that is something that's kind of interesting in from the comic book point of view. In the Howard books, Bayleet only appears in one story, and in that book or in that story, there is time, implied to have passed. That's the story's Queen of the Black Coast.
Yeah, it takes place across a 2-year time span, I think it is.
Mm-hmm. And the comics really ran with that as far as Bayleet as a love interest. I mean, she got her own comic book limited series a year ago. She's been written about a lot in the Dark Horse comics and in the Marvel comics as being Conan's one true love. And, no mention of her in film and television and nothing.
Yeah, and that's a shame, because I really wish that we could get like a good Conan franchise going, so that we actually could get that story told and done full justice, or justice rather. Because imagine if you get that thing going on Netflix. I mean, the Queen of the Black Coast storyline, that's full season right there, where the first and the last episode would be from the original story, and then you have 2 years of Conan and Bayleet's life together to fill out.
Yeah,
and also the actress that Millennium hired to play Red Sonja would have been perfect as Bayleet.
True. Wow, yeah, that would have been good. To get back to this film, and man, I'm having a hard time staying on this film because it's so bad. It's just, I won't necessarily say that the film itself is bad. I mean, it's a perfectly passable, enjoyable film. It's just not a Conan film, it doesn't feel like. And
is it enjoyable in its own right? If you take Conan away from it, is it enjoyable?
Visually, yes, but story-wise, it's kind of stupid.
Because I remember when I saw that movie in theaters, it was so bad. I mean, for instance, with the Milius movie, I can say, okay, fine, this isn't Conan. I just have to get that out of my mind, and then I can enjoy it as a standalone movie about a completely different freed slave who also happens to be called Conan, and I can enjoy it on those terms. Whereas this movie, I can enjoy individual aspects of it. I can enjoy that scene. I can enjoy that shot. But I can't enjoy the movie as a whole because it's just so bad.
Yeah, that's really accurate, actually. I kind of feel the same way. The film feels like a composition of smaller vignettes all jammed together to form one film, but it doesn't jam together very well.
Exactly. It feels like a bunch of scenes strung together, but there's something wrong with the narrative. It doesn't feel like a movie. I'm very aware that I'm sitting and I'm watching something that's trying to be a movie. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. Trying and failing.
Yeah. So can't recommend the movie to any of you out there.
I'm very sorry to say so, but no, I can't recommend it either. I wouldn't see it if you're curious. If you want to see, can it really be that bad? Then yeah, that's the best basis for going in to watch it. And however much I would like to, I just can't recommend it beyond that. There's some good scenes here and there, But really, the most interesting thing about it is if you see it in conjunction with knowing the backstory. Like, for instance, if you see that in conjunction with having seen our upcoming retrospective, then as an exercise in, well, how bad can things go? Kind of like Fant Four Stick. It's like a movie that you don't see as a movie, but you see it to behold the train wreck you've heard so much about.
Yeah, and basically, if you have 112 minutes to spare, then sure, go ahead and watch it. Just
you have a drinking game. Like, for instance, every time there's a reshot and you spot Kate Mara's wig for the reshoots, you could do like something similar here. That would work.
Or every time you notice Rose McGowan's no eyebrow face. Jeez.
Yeah.
That was a horrible choice.
And again, there's nothing wrong with any of the actors or actresses. This is a case where everyone involved genuinely did their best to make the best movie possible. Unfortunately, and this is the best way that I can explain what went wrong with it, is that you have different key players behind the scenes that are all making different movies. And what comes out is a compromise of people behind the scenes making different movies. And in so doing, nothing good came out of it.
No, it didn't. Yeah, stick to the 82 movie. Stick to the original Howard books. Stick to the comic books, especially the Dark Horse.
But I will have to say, though, that when it comes to Howard adaptations, there is one more to check out, and no, that isn't the Cull movie, but Solomon Kane.
Solomon Kane is good. Yes,
Solomon Kane is really good.
And it just kind of flew under the radar because I didn't hear about it, but I did find it in like the Walmart DVD section on accident one day, and I was like, oh my god, they made a Solomon Kane movie.
Yeah, that's such tragic how sometimes Hollywood will, maybe not deliberately, but the end result certainly comes across as someone is trying to conspire against like movies that were a little bit too independent and too good for their own good, for not coming out of the studio system. It's what it seems like. And unfortunately, if they then end up being distributed by Lionsgate, then that's definitely the kiss of death.
Well, I guess we've been going on 2 hours. I don't know what your time is like. Maybe it's a good time to close out.
Yeah, I'm starting to run out of time here, but I think we hit many of the main beats here. And yeah, like Ivan the Mad Vandal says in the comments, Solomon Kane rocked. Should have gotten a sequel, just like Dread. Yeah, should have gotten 2 sequels.
I agree.
Because it was meant to start a trilogy. And the problem with Solomon Kane, and this is the only one, was that the investors demanded that the movie has to be an origin story. And this was the same demand that was placed upon the 2011 Conan movie. Because you see, a few years before, 2 movies came out that were called Casino Royale and Batman Begins. You may have heard about them. Because of those 2 movies, Hollywood became obsessed with origin stories. So they had like this idea in the early 2010s that whenever you do a franchise, you have to begin with an origin movie before you can start the franchise proper, which of course is complete bullcrap. If anything, you go back and do a prequel later. But no, they decided, no, you have to start with some bullcrap prequel that you don't need. Then you can do the movie you wanted to make the whole time. That's what happened with Conan, and that's what happened with Solomon Kane. And the tragedy is that both of those had sequels planned that were inevitably going to be better than what ultimately ended up on screen. But they, because of the distribution situation And Lionsgate were a big part of the reason why certainly the Conan movie did as badly as it did. It ended right there, and we never got the proper stories we should have gotten.
No. I do have an honorable mention as far as the whole sword and sorcery genre goes. In 2002, there was a film which starred a very not popular guy. Nobody knows who he is, but the guy's name was Dwayne Johnson, and he played the Scorpion King. I'm joking. The Scorpion King was actually pretty good. I would almost...
Yeah, no, sorry, carry on. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say that, yeah, it's the best sword and sorcery we've had since... up until Solomon Kane. It's honestly the best sword and sorcery since Conan the Barbarian, unless you want to include Beastmaster and the Barbarians. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd put it right next to those two.
Yeah, I would too. And to me, I kind of feel sad because after seeing Scorpion King, I thought, man, how come they don't? This character could be Conan. They could have made this character Conan. I mean, okay, skin color notwithstanding, Dwayne Johnson, I might have been able to pull it off. I don't know. I mean, they'd have to give him contacts, but
yeah, well, that was never to be.
No.
Of course, we got a shit ton of Scorpion King sequels direct to DVD. I never saw any of them, but apparently they're no good, a single one of them.
Oh God! As a historian, I literally was smashing my face into my desk when they were buying tickets to go to Thebes. I'm like, no.
I think as a historian, there's not so much you object to with Howard, especially with, I don't know how specialized you are in ancient history, but I would think that many of the objections that were against Howard and his Hyborian age would have lessened in recent decades after the discovery of Göbekli Tepe and everything like that just shifts the time scale of when we thought civilization began back by thousands of years.
Oh yeah. As a historian, one of the things that I liked about Howard's Hyborian age was this idea of the megacontinent, the Pangea, and the fact that he did take a lot of the names of places and things and made them feel familiar. Like we have Darfur. Well, he had Darfar. Zimbabwe and Zimbabwe.
Yeah, I was about to mention that because many people will, if you look at the map of the Hyborian age today, and you see, like, for instance, there's a Zimbabwe. Like, what's the big deal? Well, it actually wasn't called that at the time when the stories were made. That's a reconstruction of the ancient name, the same name that Howard used. So that was all the prescient of him.
Yeah, let me bring the map back up. His description for some of these things, they came from history books and things too. Obviously there were
exactly. He knew his history as well as anyone knew it that weren't at the cutting edge of archaeology, there with spoons digging in the sand, finding new empires and stuff like that. Beyond that, he knew ancient history as well as anyone else possibly could know at the time. And he arrived at his Hyborian kingdoms by simply going back through time and extrapolating from what was there even further back. So obviously it's fiction. He never claimed anything otherwise. But still, names and everything, there's a reason behind it. Some pretty good guesses.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And one of the things that makes it accessible too is the fact that all of his cultures were, of course, based on ancient cultures. Ophir and Corinthia are like Spain and Portugal. Obviously, Stygia is Egypt, but a more sinister Egypt, I guess.
Yeah, a pre-dynastic Egypt before the pyramids or anything like that, which is also pretty cool. And still, some of the city names, like Luxor, which is an ancient city in Egypt today, still there at the time of Stygia. So that was also a good question that Snortapus Cuber asked. How many people outside of academia had heard of Great Zimbabwe in the 1930s? No, exactly. Well, Howard had, and he incorporated into his stories. So well done, very very well done on that.
Yeah. I guess I should close out with this. Let me dig it up real quick. Here we go. Yeah, this is Robert E. Howard's grave now in Brownwood Cemetery. Greenleaf Cemetery is actually what it's called. It's in Brownwood, Texas. And, you know, you can see that he's interred with both of his parents. And one of the neat things, and I have found this both times I have visited, is that visitors will leave tokens of affection on right by his grave. As you can see there by the stone, you know, somebody left him a bottle of Shiner Bock. There are a couple of candles and a book, a fantasy book of some kind, which had whited out mostly from the sun and the rain. But I love this just because, you know, he hasn't totally been forgotten. People still revere him, remember him, besides us, you know.
Yeah, that's the beauty with his legacy, that it will continue to live on. And he may not be the most known author that is out there, but he is still revered. And even some really bad movies haven't been able to change that. So the brand is there, and so is the Robert E. Howard brand. It just has to be brought a little bit back into the forefront again. So fingers crossed that more games, upcoming Netflix adaptations will be good and serve to do that and expose the writings of this criminally underrated writer to a whole slew of new generations.
I hope so. Well, Andre, it has been my honor, my pleasure, and I am so grateful that you chose to take some time out to talk to me about this. I can't thank you enough for agreeing to come on.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
And of course, you know, if you ever need me for any other Howard or Conan or anything consultation, you know, feel free to ask me. I'm at your disposal.
I shall keep that in mind, and I'll get back to you when I have something.
All right. And well, I mean, if you out there in the audience, y'all who are listening, I hope you will take a chance on Howard. You know, if you're going to look at science fiction or fantasy or anything else, you really owe it to yourself to check out Howard first, to read a writer who knew how to use his words effectively, who knew how to tell good stories with no agendas, with no you know, with nothing but telling a good story, which is what we really need now. You know, I feel like a lot of people have lost that these days. But thank you all very much for coming in. Thank you, Andre. And I guess we will go ahead and close out.
Yes, all right. And yeah, thanks for having me. And be sure to subscribe to this channel and help share this video.
Thank you. We'll see you next time.
All right, take care.